Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa and today I'm showing you how to add a smocked insert to a pattern. I'm using the Children's Corner Lucy pattern today because it is a very simple pattern, making it really good for demonstrating this, but these principles should apply to the front of any pattern. Start out by taking the pattern piece that you are going to add your insert to and cutting it out of paper. This essentially gives you a second version of that pattern piece that you can cut up without destroying your original. Then decide how big you want your insert to be. I did this by measuring the number of rows of smocking that I wanted on my smocking pleater, and then you need to add a little bit extra to that, because if you think of it this way, if you want, in my case I wanted 6 rows of smocking, if I hadn't added a little extra to it, I would have been stitching right on those 2 rows. So add a little more to it. I rounded up to the nearest 1/4 inch, but I would actually recommend just adding a full 1/4 inch because rounding up, it worked, but it was a little tight, and I almost still ended up sewing over my bottom and top rows of smocking. So in my case, I decided on a 2.5 inch smocked insert. So then I went back to my pattern and I decided where I wanted the smocked insert to start. And I drew a line at that point. I then measured down from that line 2.5 inches and drew another line. Then I cut the pattern apart along each of those lines. This gave me 3 pieces: the yoke, the insert, and the skirt. And since this is no longer one piece, all of these pieces now have to have seam allowance added to it. So I cut 1/2 inch strips of paper and attached them along each spot where it was cut. So the top of the skirt, the top and bottom of the insert, and the bottom of the yoke piece. I chose 1/2 inch because with the Children's Corner patterns, they typically are 1/4 inch seam allowances on all the side seams and then 1/2 inch seam allowances on any skirt seams and things like that. So I did it just to match that. I also wouldn't go any smaller for a smocked insert just because having 1/2 inch at the top and bottom allows enough room for holding rows of pleating when you pleat your inserts. So now the pattern is put together, how do you use it? Well, again, I'm assuming that you are using a front piece of a pattern, and most likely your pattern calls for 2 front pieces to be cut on the fold. One for the outer part of the dress or bodice, and one for the lining. And essentially what you're doing is you're still going to cut one of them out of your original pattern piece for the lining, and you're going to cut the outer piece using these new pieces that you've kind of cut apart. So in this case, I am cutting out one of the yoke and one of the skirt, and the original pattern piece was cut on the fold, so that still applies. Then for the smocked piece, I actually cut a mirror image of the pattern piece out of paper and taped the 2 together so that I had the whole piece. That's just easier for me to think about when it comes to a smocked insert, because you do have to do a little bit of math in order to do any kind of smocking. So for that insert piece, I cut a strip of white fabric that was the height of my pattern piece, and at least 3 times the width. With smocking, usually the insert is at least 3 times the width for geometric smocking, and then 3.5 to 4 times the width for picture smocking. I was doing a little bit of picture smocking, so I went ahead and did 3.5 times the width. After the insert piece is cut out, just proceed with pleating and smocking as you normally would. I am assuming that if you're watching this video, you have some experience with smocking and smocked inserts, so I'm not going to go over that in a lot of detail here. After the piece has been smocked and blocked, go ahead and lay the pattern piece on top of it. and then trace out around the armholes and, if necessary, the side edges. In my case, it was necessary to do the side edges because the Lucy dress kind of has tapered corners, so that means that everything has to be trimmed off. So I marked on here with just a washable marker. I then removed the pattern piece and go to the sewing machine, set your machine to a narrow short zigzag stitch. And then stitch the piece using those lines as a guide, but stitching just slightly to the inside of the marks. Cut the pleated piece around along the outside of those stitches, making sure not to cut them. If you've done this right, you shouldn't have much, if any, of the marker left on the piece, and it should be shaped about the same as the pattern piece. Now stitch the insert to the bottom of the yoke piece, and then stitch the skirt to the bottom of the insert. And now you have this piece which should be shaped about the same as the original front piece of the pattern. At this point, you can proceed with the directions on your pattern, just using that piece as the outer part of your garment. Thank you for watching. I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll do my best to answer them. And I hope you will join me next week for another handmade happening.